Hey guys, it's Ben from Board to Bits, and this is part 13 of our video series on making a point-and-click game in Unity. So in our last couple of videos, we set up our image viewer. We were seeing kind of the little bit of the workings of it here. And now we're going to get into our actual 3D model viewer, what we're calling the observer. I would have loved to call it the inspector, but Unity has kind of a stranglehold on that word. So we're just going to call this the observer for our purposes. It's actually going to use a similar structure to how our canvas system works for the image viewer, but we're going to be doing it in 3D space, so there's going to be obviously some differences. I'm actually going to start by turning off this canvas so that we're not blocking our view with that. And now we can, but we are going to kind of look at the structure, because what we had here was we have the IV canvas, and then in the background was this shader, which was this panel. Actually, I'll turn this back on. And then the image holder appeared a little bit in front of that because it's lower in the hierarchy. But and that's like what the image that we wanted to show was. And we want to do something similar for our 3D viewer. For our observer, we're going to need some way of looking at the thing, in which case it's going to be a camera, not a canvas. We're going to still want a shade. And we're going to have to use, though, a plane for that instead of using a panel in UI. And then lastly, the image holder is actually going to be our 3D model. So let's get started. I'm going to turn this back off again. And we're going to go up to Game Object, and we're going to create a new camera. Now, if you haven't worked with multiple cameras before, it can be a little bit funky, because what you're going to basically be doing is you're going to be layering multiple cameras. And how that works is that if you have these different depths here, you'll see this one's depth 0, our main camera is depth -1. The higher the depth, the more precedence it takes, which is why right now we're not seeing anything from our main camera. We're seeing just what this camera is viewing, which right now is just this wall. But if I grab this Z slider here and pull it back, you'll see that that's what we're seeing is the actual the view of this new camera that we've added. However, what's kind of cool about what this camera does is that if you are ever in a spot where you can't see anything and you're just looking off into the distance, you will actually start to see what the you can set it up so that you can see what the camera behind it has to see. So for example, if I pull this camera up, let me zoom this out a little bit here. If I pull this camera up, right now we're seeing the world behind it here, or just the skybox rather, which is what this clear flags is for. If we go to a solid color, you'll see that we just see whatever color we set it to. However, if we go depth only, what happens is it will show what is behind, or it will start to show, instead of showing whatever's behind here, it shows what this camera is viewing instead now. So we end up seeing it's kind of weird, we're looking over this wall and then into the room. This is kind of sort of the idea of what they do in games like Portal, where you're suddenly seeing, kind of weird angles and stuff because of where your portals are positioned. It's basically, I'm assuming, using cameras in kind of a clever way like this. So the purpose of this for us, though, is that what we're going to do is we're going to take this new camera we have and we're going to rename this to be the observer camera. And what it's going to be responsible for is we're going to send it way away from the world, so we're not going to ever see any part of the world with this camera, but we're going to instead see an object that we send to it. So first, let's kind of get this camera out of the way. We're going to position it at X 100, and then Y can be 0 and 0. So right now, this camera is really not seeing anything at all. It's just looking out into the void. But we're going to focus on that camera now over here. We're going to add two things to it. We're going to add a shade, but in this case, our shade, and we'll add it right here so it gets childed. We're going to do 3D object plane. We're going to rename that to shade, and we're going to need to rotate this first of all. So we're going to rotate it on its x-axis by 270 degrees, so that way it's still facing, it's going to be facing our camera, because otherwise we wouldn't see anything. We want to make sure the normals are set correctly. And then we're going to back it up about 5 away from the camera, we'll say. And we'll make that an even 5. And we're also going to scale this up by 2 in all directions, just to make sure that we're always filling up the screen. As our screen gets bigger here, we don't want to ever start seeing the edges of the world, or seeing, you know, around the shader. We want to make sure the shade is always in front. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to change the material of this, because right now it's a solid white material, basically. So what we can do is we're going to go into our materials folder and create a new material, and we're just going to call this shade material. And we're going to go up here to shader. We're going to keep it as standard, but where it says rendering mode opaque, we're going to make that transparent. What that's going to let us do is actually set an alpha for this, and it will have an effect. So if we go to the albedo here, and we're going to bring that all the way down to black. And then, like our panel we had for our IV canvas, we're going to set the transparency to about 75%. So I'm going to say alpha of 180. And that now makes that a little bit see-through. You can see it kind of changed there when we typed that in. And so we're going to close the color. And now we're just going to drag this onto our plane, our shade plane. And now we see that we're seeing through this camera. And at that point, there's nothing else to see, so it reverts back to the main camera, which is seeing this, this view here. Lastly, we're going to add, we had an image holder for our IV canvas that then took the sprite in that we were going to use. For this one, we're going to add a empty game object. We'll right-click and go create empty. And we're going to set this about 2 away on the z-axis, so it's in between. If I move here, if we zoom in and I move this a little bit here, then I click on game object, you see that it's kind of sitting in between this plane and the camera. And this we're going to call rig. And this isn't actually going to be the object that we're looking at, rather it's going to hold the object much like our camera rig holds our main camera. And in the next video, we're actually going to look at why we're doing it in that way. But just rest assured that we want to have this separate rig that then is going to be apparent to our whatever object we're looking at. So with all these things in place, we can now start adding some scripts to things so that we can make these function and turn on and turn off this observer camera, much like we did for our IV canvas. So let's go back into scripts and into interactables. We're going to create 2 new scripts. The first one, we're going to say C# script, and we're going to call it OBS Camera. And that is basically going to be the script that we put onto, in fact, we can drag that on right now. We'll drag that onto our observer camera, because that's going to be what controls when the camera is looking, how it's looking, all that stuff. Next, we're going to create another C# script and just call this observer. And this is kind of like the image viewer was. This is what we're going to add to props to make them interact in such a way that they turn on the observer camera. So now let's dive into MonoDevelop and look at what we have to do to make all of this work. First thing we're going to do, we're going to go into, I'm going to zoom this in. We're going to go into our game manager here. And much like we have this public IV canvas, we're going to make a reference to our observer camera. So we're going to say public OBS camera, and we'll just call that OBS camera. And so that is our reference that we can always go to the game manager now if we want to somehow interact or tell this camera to do something. Next thing we can do is we can go into our new scripts here. So if we open up scripts, interactables, we can open up both observer and OBS camera. So for OBS camera, actually we'll start with the camera. We're going to create 2 variables here. The first one we're going to call public transform model. And this one we can actually hide in the inspector because we're going to set this via scripting. The next one we're going to do, though, is going to be visible, and it's going to be public transform rig. Now we'll save that. We can jump back over to Unity, and we'll see if we go to our observer camera, we now have this rig slot here, so we're going to drop our rig into that. And the reason for that is when we are actually populating our observer camera with the model, we're going to want to be able to parent it to that rig. And that's going to give us a little more control over that, as well as when we're manipulating the object. Next thing we're going to do, actually while we're in Unity, let's quickly double check here and see, I did not wire my camera, so I should drag this camera to our observer camera slot. And I'm also going to go to our blue cube, and I'm just going to add that observer component right now, so that we don't forget later, and when I try and do it and it doesn't work, I'm not wondering why. So we've got those all set up for ourselves now. Now let's go into here. We've got our two transforms here, and that's all we need in our observer camera for right now. Last thing we're going to do, though, is we're going to when we click on an observer, we want to interact, and then we're going to tell our observer camera to turn on and populate with our object that we want, so on and so forth. So in order to do that, we're going to delete all of this. We don't need it right now. And we're going to inherit from our interactable script. So we're going to say observer interactable. And with that, because we have our virtual interact script, we can go back to our observer and say public override interact. We don't need the base interact. That was just for testing purposes before. And now we can say, instead, what we want to do here is we want to turn on this observer camera, and we also want, like I've been saying, to populate it with this object. Now, how are we going to do that? We're going to assume right now that when you click on a given prop in your game, you want to look at that model. Like if there's a model of a statue and you're clicking on it, you want to be inspecting that statue. Or if there's a machine, you want to be looking around that machine. So one way we could, basically what we would do if we were just in our editor here, how we would do that is we might say duplicate and then drag that into our rig, and that would be our model that we could look at. And we can actually do that in scripting pretty easily, just by using our instantiate function. So what I'm going to say is game object item, and this is going to be the item that we're observing, is going to be equal to instantiate, and I'm going to instantiate the game object that our observer is attached to. So basically what this does is says, if I go back into Unity, go to our blue cube, when I click on and interact with the observer, it's going to take this game object and make a duplicate of it. Then we just need to tell it to set its parent instead of to just right now it has no parent. We want to make sure that the parent is the observer camera's rig. And we can do that pretty easily by saying item.transform .set parent is going to be set to game manager for the instance .obs camera .rig, and that is a transform, so we can just set that as the parent. I also want to make sure that once we do this, I want the item to be centered on the rig, because that rig we've specifically put it so it's going to be right in the middle between the camera and the shader. So we're going to say item.transform.position equals, item.transform.local position, because we want it to be relative to its parent, which is the rig, is equal to vector3.0. Save that. Now, the next thing we want to do is a little bit, it's a little bit weird, but I'll show you the reason for it. Actually, you'll probably see the reason for it more in the next video, but I can kind of tell you about it right now, which is if we focus on our blue cube here. Nope, I don't want to change the name of it. Blue cube. If I go into here and I focus on this blue cube, we see that the actual point of the origin of it, or the pivot point of it, is at the bottom of it. And we did that for a reason. We did that so that things would actually be sitting on top of the table properly, and that's good overall. But when we're trying to manipulate this and look around it, we don't necessarily want it to look like it's hinging on this weird point on its bottom. We want it to, rotate from its center. So we need to get this cube model and push it back down so that it's actually where the, so it's centered on the pivot point. And we can do that relatively easily. We can say item.transform.get child, and this you're going to want to make sure that this is the first child in the hierarchy here, the model versus the camera position, so that you can get it this way. You can say get child 0, and that's going to get the first child it finds, which will be that that model. And then we're going to say dot transform. Actually, does get child return a transform? That actually returns the transform. We don't need to say get transform dot local position. And again, we're just going to set that equal to vector3.0. Now, all we need to do is turn on the camera. So we can say, we want to say observer camera and set it enabled to, or set active to true. And so we can go game manager dot instance dot OBS Camera dot game object dot set active true. One last thing we can do, we're not going to need this for right now, but it will be very helpful in our next step, is that we want to set the item that we brought to be this model that we're calling it here. So I'm going to do it before I set it active. I'm going to say, I'm actually just going to copy this here, paste it. So the observer camera dot model should be equal to item. And that's going to let us do have control both of, like I said, that rig and now that model that we're looking at as we interact and manipulate with it. That right there is very similar to in our IV canvas when we were setting the image to the image holder. So with all of that, we can save this, go back to our scene, and if I now hit play, before I hit play, one other thing we want to do, again, similar, with my IV canvas, I had it set so that the game manager will turn it off at the beginning of the scene. We want to do the same thing with the observer camera. So let's quickly jump over here, go to game manager, and say OBS, in awake, we're going to say obs.camera.gameObject.setActive false. Now it looked like we had a warning here. Cannot convert game object to transform. Oh, we need to say item.transform. That's no big deal there. And now we're setting that active, so that should all work. All right. That should go away. Yes. So now we'll save this, hit play. That camera turns itself off at the beginning of the scene. We can go to the table, to our cube. Right now we can look around in that. And now if we click our cube, what we should see is the screen will darken and a new copy of our cube will be right in front of us. If we click, sure enough, there it is. It's not huge in our scene, but it's big enough there that we can see it. And in our next video, we're going to look at how we can actually kind of click and hold to rotate around it and look at all sides of it and really kind of get a good view of it, which is the whole kind of purpose of this sort of a interaction. So thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Hey guys, one more quick thing I wanted to tell you before we close out this video, which is if you saw down at the bottom here, it's saying there are 2 audio listeners in the scene. Please ensure there's only ever one. That is because our second camera comes with an audio listener put right on it. We can actually remove that component, and that will get rid of that warning for you. If we save and hit play again, that clears right out. So now, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time.